You're with Patrick Henningsen on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Hello. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Welcome back to the Patrick Henningsen Show here on TNT, today's News Talk. What a fantastic segment again from Christian. He's unearthed some interesting stories for us. That one was very interesting. We thought we'd throw that in there. A little bit of culture in the first hour to break up some of the hard politics that we're going to have to wade through over the next 2 hours. But to help us wade through the situation in Ukraine, it's intensified, certainly on the diplomatic front, on the sanctions front, on the war of words. Is unprecedented. The things that we're seeing and hearing really are unbelievable. I'm trying to process this in real time. It's challenging. We've witnessed a few wars, conflicts, and protracted situations over the years, but this has a whole nother level. There's whole new dimensions at play here. And to help us navigate through this a little bit as best we can, especially looking at it from the UK political and NATO perspective. I have on the line former ambassador, UK ambassador to Syria and Bahrain, Peter Ford, no stranger to the world of international relations, is joining us on the line right now. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Patrick. Good to be with you again.
It's great to be with you too, Peter. And we are reading some of the same stuff. I'm trying to keep up with how fast everything is moving. You can probably appreciate, Peter, it's like you have to follow all of these different individual countries, and NATO are all saying some similar things, some different things. And so we have to survey all of that chatter and understand where, quote, NATO is coming from. But I find it's easier, Peter, just to listen to Washington and London, because to me, that's who's driving NATO policy at the end of the day. How are you reading this right now, Peter? We're now, 75 days in, 76th day, I'm not sure exactly. So we're a little bit over 2 months now. And it seems like the rhetoric is still ramping up, Peter. It's pretty extraordinary.
Yes, but it could be worse, Patrick, I think. They could actually mean it. We're seeing a lot of bluster and signaling, a lot of posturing, but I think that basically the key element here is that Washington think that the war is going well for them. At the outset, they were spooked, perhaps like President Putin himself. They thought it would be a Russian walkover. When that didn't happen, when Ukraine pushed back, when Russia appeared to get bogged down, Washington started to think, hey, this isn't so bad. Actually, this might turn out to be just what we've been looking for, getting Russia bogged down in another Afghanistan. It's our dreams come true. And I think this is probably still the way they see it in Washington, with a nuance of difference from London. I'll come to that in a second. But I think in Washington, they think the war is going well from their point of view. The Ukrainians appear to be holding the Russians at bay to some degree, and the Russians appear to be taking quite heavy losses. And in the meanwhile, U.S. arms manufacturers are making hay. Joe Biden has just signed off, I think, on, I lose track with how many billions, but quite a lot of billions more of arms purchases to help Ukraine and to help the Democrats' electoral prospects. So I come to London. Here the logic is slightly different. Here, London is also figures it's on a winner, but London has to try harder than Washington. London has to put itself forward as a ringleader, as the pace setter within NATO in order to shore up the position of our shaky Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, to shore up his position. We're told by the media that the opinion polls show that the war is popular and that Boris's performance is seen as one of his few pluses set against all the scandals in which he's currently involved at the same time. So for him, the war has been a godsend. We might even say that Mr. Putin has saved Boris's neck because had the special military operation not been launched back in February, when Boris was on the ropes politically, people would not bet on his political future. And he's bounced back off the ropes, exploiting cynically the plight of the Ukrainians to position himself as a popular warmonger. And therefore, I think the rhetoric you hear from the Brits is slightly more hawkish than the rhetoric from Washington. Washington, above all, I think, does not want to get dragged into the conflict. If any of the NATO countries did get dragged in, Uncle Sam would inevitably be dragged in next, and they much rather keep control in their own hands in Washington. Anyway, I don't think any of the NATO countries seriously do want to get directly involved, but they push the limits. The polls, in particular, backed up by the Brits. So they're taking risks and they're sounding more bellicose.
So Poland's really being pushed to the front, aren't they, Peter? Poland and maybe next the Baltics. They're a little bit quiet there, but Poland is really kind of pushed out to the front. You know, they're hosting this, what do you call it? Airlift for arms and whatnot into Ukraine. They're one of the main thoroughfares, aren't they, for everything? Refugees going one way, arms going the other. What do you think about that in terms of Polish politically, geopolitically? It's quite a position to be put in, isn't it?
Yeah, and quite significantly also, the Poles wanted to transfer Soviet-era aircraft in their possession to Ukraine, but it was Washington which said niet. It was Washington being more cautious, and our dear British Defense Secretary just 2 days ago said he stood with the Poles on this. Well, that's easy to do where he's sitting, but thankfully, I never thought I'd hear myself saying this, but thankfully there are some cooler heads in Washington. But the Poles, the Poles and the Russians have a lot of history behind them, do they not? A lot of feeling, a lot of history. And the Poles also have a tendency to be histrionic, I think, and that's what's going on here. But they feel comforted to know that Britain has their back.
Yeah, so Britain's kind of playing the role of sheepdog for Washington, aren't they? Kind of keeping some of the, let's be honest, Peter, some of the European countries, they're not full-throated into this war effort, if you know what I mean. And they do require a little bit of, let's just say, encouragement and a little bit of cheerleading from the sidelines. Is that Britain's role in NATO?
That's what we've become. I mean, not long ago we were poodles, but now sheepdogs is a bit of an upgrade. But that is exactly right. We're there to do the bidding of the Washington shepherd.
So you mentioned something in the opener, Peter. I think that's really important. I'm trying to get into the mentality here of what ministers and defense ministers, prime ministers, what they're thinking, what they're thinking in Washington. You mentioned Afghanistan, and I keep hearing this repeated all the time. We need to make this Putin's Afghanistan. It's always this kind of hearkening back to some kind of a template, as it were. John McCain did this in Syria. He said, we need to get TOW missiles into Syria and turn Syria into their Afghanistan for Vladimir Putin. And that was the plan. So it's always this referencing to some formula from the past that appeared to be successful. And I keep hearing this repeated. So I think, is that significant, Peter, in terms of understanding the mentality and maybe in terms of the prognosis of how this is going to go in the end? Or what do you think about this?
Yes, I think this is seriously the U.S. Strategy to keep Russia bogged down. And the funny thing here is that actually it was NATO that got bogged down in Afghanistan longer years than the Soviets ever were. I mean, how many years were we in Afghanistan? It's well over almost 2 decades. But I don't think that's the quagmire they like to be reminded of. But it is, I think, the serious intention, the war objective on the side of Washington and NATO generally is for the Russians to get bogged down, if not thoroughly defeated.
Yeah, I can't see. I'm a little bit shocked, Peter, because I just don't see how you can make any scenario like this for Russia in Ukraine, because you're not talking about extended supply lines here. They're literally next door. The DPR, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, they've had 8 years. They have their own very well-developed defense force, very well-developed command structures. The contact lines are, incredibly well monitored and defended, and they're pushing further west at the moment, because now with the help of the Russian military. So I see this in many ways, Peter, and correct me if I might be off base here, but this is an incredibly low cost affair for Washington. If you compare it to something like, prosecuting a war halfway across the world like the U.S. and Britain did in Iraq or Afghanistan, for instance, that's a much higher cost operation in many different ways and requires a lot more resources and money. I don't see this. So the idea of Putin getting bogged down the way that the theater looks now, Peter, it doesn't add up to me. I don't know if how you think. What do you think about that?
Few of us really have much of a handle on this and be able to predict with confidence how the conflict is going to go. But we can see that Washington and its allies hope that Russia will get bogged down, and there is some chance of that happening. And it's win-win for Washington. They've not got boots on the ground. They've not got body bags being brought back. Their forces are not actually being put to the test as Russia's are. This is a point that struck me recently, that an attacking force always faces more difficulty than a defending force, and it's commonly said that the attacker needs at least 3 times the number of men and kit as a defender. The Ukrainians are also fighting on home soil and have other advantages, not least an endless supply of materiel from the West. So the Russian forces are being put to the test, and not surprisingly, it's not a continuous success story. Well, I bet if NATO forces were being put to a similar test, we would see endless stories of failure. It's not, after all, as though the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan had been stellar successes militarily, particularly for the British, when you remember Basra and Helmand. And in fact, I see accounts in the British press today, real military experts, British military types, complaining that the British forces don't have the kit, the modern technology to keep up their end if they had the misfortune actually get dragged in to Ukraine. So it doesn't surprise me that Russia is taking some heavy hits, but it's very difficult to assess quite how serious those hits are. But just to finish up on a related point, the British are already taking hits in the sense that British soldiers are almost certainly already taking or becoming casualties. The British government, the military censors, have issued what used to be called D-notices, censorship of awkward news. Peter Hitchens surfaced this news 10 days ago in the Mail on Sunday, complaining how he was being muzzled. He didn't say exactly, of course, by definition, he couldn't, what was being muzzled, but he hinted strongly that it's what I was just saying, that the British already have had boots on the ground in Ukraine, probably delivering munitions, training the Ukrainians, and the Russians managed to score a bullseye. In fact, there was one particular incident about 3 weeks ago when we can say with near certainty that a lot of foreign troops that were involved in munitions supply took the hit. But the British public must not be allowed to know this. That's why the military censor stepped in. That is why the British press is muzzled. Not that the British press, or 99% of it, actually need muzzling. They're perfectly happy to go along with military censorship.
That's extraordinary, Peter, that even one single author or one single piece of information coming from one writer, Peter Hitchens, being already one of the very few, I think we can agree, in the mainstream UK press that would ever go off script on anything. He's one of them. I can count them on less than one hand. I'm sure you can probably count them on only a couple of fingers. That's extraordinary, but that's something the Russian MOD has been announcing this. U.S. Special Forces, British Special Forces, they've been not naming the platoons, but basically saying there's this many here, there's a dozen there, there's a dozen there, there's a dozen there. And our government's reactions in the West is that's all Russian disinformation. It's Russian propaganda. Don't listen to it. It's not true. So you're saying that's a high probability that that's the case. I would expect they would be in there, Peter, quite frankly, because they've been in every other conflict in the same capacity, right?
And the funny thing is that a D-notice is not even necessary. I would wager that the great British public, which has been so thoroughly brainwashed by now, would not bat an eyelid about news that British soldiers had been killed and injured in Ukraine. So the censorship is really unnecessary. There's another thing, though, here. And ironically, I don't think it's in the Russian interest to make a big thing of this, because it could lead to more escalation. Once it becomes public, once you have a declared policy of direct military involvement, things go up a notch. and both you and your adversary have to hit even harder. So it rather suits the Russians to keep this episode and the involvement of NATO troops on the ground in the fog of uncertainty.
So there's a little bit of a shadow war going on there in parallel. Both sides are aware of it, and so you think Russia just prices that in to the equation, basically, right?
The Russians could very easily come out with a statement that we have irrefutable evidence, I'm sure they do, that British casualties have been incurred in Ukraine. But that, I think they would reason, is not in their interest. After all, they've already got their retaliation in. Huh? They inflicted casualties on the Brits. They'd gain no advantage by making it public, and could cause escalation with NATO.
So that brings up another question, Peter, is how is it in Britain's or America's interest to have maybe say a handful of platoons of special forces, even if they're trainers, or you might have some actually combatants in there. There's tons of them unofficially under the mercenary banner that are already in there, including some active service people that are on leave, quote, on leave, or mercenaries with major firms that are going in under the Ukrainian Foreign Legion. But if you consider the totality of the fighting force that Ukraine claims to have on paper, Peter, talking about 200,000 in total, including conscripts. How is it in the West's interest to sacrifice any of their men in a conflict that, from all reports that we're seeing, Peter, isn't going so well for the Ukrainian side? That's the question that I can't quite understand.
Well, I think it's technical and related to the quality of Ukrainian military equipment, much of it dating back to the Soviet era. What they're being sent by the Brits and others is a lot of very new equipment that will perform better and give them more capability. And of course, it has to come with a training package. That means having trainers on the ground. And it's all calculated to keep stoking the fires of war, to keep the Ukrainians standing up. Good heavens, we don't want this conflict to finish tomorrow, do we?
When has there ever been this amount of money, basically poured into a situation like this? We've only been going, Peter, for 2.5 months. And already the sum total of the funding, from what I've read, and you could probably verify or not, my claim here is that this is already orders of magnitude more than was thrown in Syria in terms of arms and total money spent. Is that an accurate assessment at this point?
Almost certainly, yes. Yeah, we're talking about real armies here, not ragtag gangs of jihadis. We're talking about real armies with inexhaustible need for weapons. But this is a little bit the Achilles heel with the Brits right at this moment with our cost of living crisis. Even enthusiasts for the war and British involvement raise an eyebrow about the eye-watering sums that we're spending on the Ukraine war, and the government are careful not to trumpet these amounts too much. It's the one area where the government is vulnerable to criticism, that they're pouring hundreds of millions into the Ukraine conflict when the British public need that money to help deal with the cost of living crisis.
Yes, yeah, and I assume there's potentially other pressing needs even for the people of Ukraine other than bullets and howitzers and artillery. There's probably some real bona fide humanitarian impending disasters at any given moment with the people in that country. With supply chains, you think our supply chains are interrupted here in the West because of sanctions? Imagine what the internal supply chains are like in a country like Ukraine right now, with everything that's going on, the fighting and whatnot, Peter. But there's two numbers, Peter, that are important here. One of them is civilian casualties. This is a major barometer in which the international community will gauge the level of devastation and maybe factor in the need for intervention, be it diplomatic, be it military or whatever, humanitarian, civilian casualties. And the other is soldiers, military casualties. Now, these are two numbers that we're having a very hard time getting a fix on. Now, I just saw this report. This is on Forbes magazine, dated May 3rd, and they're citing the United Nations. According to the UN, as of May 1st, the UN estimates 3,000 dead civilians in the fighting so far since February 24th. Okay, 3,000. And if you read down this, it's a very interesting report, Peter. If you read down to the fine print, they make this statement that at least half of these 3,000 are from the Donetsk and Lugansk area, or the Donbass. So I'm assuming by reading into that, because the UN's not getting specific about who they're attributing these civilian deaths to, I assume that if it's in the Donbass, it's very likely they might have died at the hands, or a great many of them, by the Ukrainian armed forces. And if you look at the reports of the Ukrainian armed forces using civilians and apartment blocks as human shields, this has even been admitted by the Washington Post, by international agencies have also admitted this, then it's very possible, Peter, that a large portion of this 3,000 dead civilians in this conflict, which is very low considering the volume of fighting, I would say, I'm surprised, but we'll take that at face value, that a large portion, maybe the majority, maybe 2/3, are at the hands of Ukrainian armed forces. So if that's the case, and I'm estimating here, just reading between the lines, Peter, the Western media, the rhetoric from all our politicians is that Russia is targeting civilians. We keep hearing this over and over. They're bombing hospitals and schools. They're looking for civilians. Putin wants to kill Ukrainians. That's the narrative. But the numbers don't seem to reflect that, Peter. So I'm saying to myself, Peter, if Russia's if their policy is to target civilians, they're not very good at it. But that's just, we're being facetious, Peter. The reality is, if your policy is not to target civilians, then you're going to incur costs on the military side, because it's much more difficult to be discriminatory in your military operations than it is to do shock and awe, Donald Rumsfeld style, a la Iraq. But what do you see on this point, Peter? And compare this to the situation in Syria, because the civilian death toll was constantly being changed and inflated in Syria, but it was used to drive the international opinion, I think. This is a different situation here. What do you think about this?
Yeah. Yes, yeah. The two are so similar. I sense Groundhog Day. What's happening in Ukraine? What happened previously in Syria? In Syria, the number of civilian casualties was vastly inflated. The so-called annihilation of Aleppo ended up with the exit through safe corridors of about 3,000 jihadis and their families. The numbers actually hurt, of civilians actually hurt, was only ever a tiny fraction of the numbers that were being bandied around. But of course, the Western media, particularly the European media, will believe absolutely anything that they're fed by their Ukrainian PR handlers without question. It took a leak, I think, from the Pentagon a week or so ago. There was a story, I think, in the New York Times that to the effect, why is Putin showing restraint?
Really?
Yeah. Google it. Yeah,
Okay,
why
I missed
why
that
is
one. That's interesting.
Putin showing restraint? But this fits with my theory that there are some slightly cooler heads in Washington who don't want to get dragged in, or if they go in, they want it to be of their volition, not because they've been manipulated into it by the Ukrainian PR or by the Western media. And so they've been damping down some of the worst excesses of hysteria. But you don't get that damping down in Britain or elsewhere in Europe. So yeah, the UN numbers are credible. I'm amazed that the UN has been permitted to keep publishing these figures. It's so uncharacteristic. There's some hero out there who deserves decoration. But their figures are much more likely to be accurate.
Wow. Yeah. And so that's the civilian figure side. And so that there's not a lot of red meat there for the international, quote, international community to raise Cain over Russia's genocide. Let's say that term's being thrown around a lot. But on the soldier side, Peter, this is even more interesting. So, and we can all agree, Peter, that in war, each side is going to want to minimize its casualties and inflate their opponents. That's certainly the case here with Russia and Ukraine. So it's very difficult to get an actual read on it. I'm going halfway between their official claims, and what maybe their opponents claiming, going halfway. So it's a fairly even tally if I go by that equation here. But my question is this, Peter. It's very possible that the casualties sustained on the Ukrainian side are incredibly high. I'm not saying that Russia's aren't high as well, but I tend to think, having followed the dailies for the last 3 weeks, it seems to me, just especially in the last 3 or 4 weeks, that Ukraine has sustained quite a lot of casualties militarily. So if that number was to be truly known, how does that change the calculus in terms of Western public support for the war effort? Because it seems to me that our politicians, Peter, Defense Secretary in the UK as well, just said that success is very possible. So the party line in the West in NATO is that Ukraine's almost winning, on the verge of winning, or will win in the end. We just need to, equip them with the right kit and stay resolute in our solidarity, etc. But how would that change if the true number? Because the true numbers are going to eventually be, they're going to be known at some point, aren't they? In the future, Peter, what do you think about this?
Not necessarily. In a wartime situation like this, not sure we'll ever discover the truth. But I think the Ukrainian casualties are being kept secret mainly to shore up Ukrainian morale. And to continue to present this picture for the international audience that plucky little Ukraine is doing well and inflicting major damage on the wicked Russians. But to tell you the truth, if it became public that the Ukrainians had lost 50,000 soldiers, I don't think we in the West would bat an eyelid. We're ready to die to the last Ukrainian. We would feel the reaction, I think, would be, oh, well, they're dying for their country and they got a lot more soldiers. They got 300,000, something like that. It's their fight. I don't think it would affect the calculation of our politicians or our public opinion to see the Ukrainian military taking big hits.
No, I tend to agree with you on that. It's astonishing, Peter. Quite frankly, I just do not see NATO expressing any desire to lose, one of their soldiers officially, anyway. But they don't seem to have a problem with Ukraine. It's like an open-ended tally for Ukrainian casualties. I think that's just morally reprehensible, but I don't know. Well, we'll talk about that after the break. I'm here with Peter Ford, former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. We're sizing up the situation in Ukraine, the fallout, the politics, and also what's going on the battlefield as well. We'll continue this conversation after the break here on TNT, Today's News Talk. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We'll be right back.
The midterms and America votes on November 8th. With his expert analysis and opinion, this is TNT Radio's Jeremy Beck.
All 22 Donald Trump-endorsed candidates won their respective Republican primaries in Indiana and Ohio in what was considered a test of the former president's power as a GOP kingmaker. With more than 130 endorsements in midterm races to date, Donald Trump's influence will be very significant through to the November midterm elections. Trump has not been shy in endorsing some controversial candidates. For instance, 8 of his endorsements for Indiana and Ohio voted to overturn the 2020 election results. One of them was Warren Davidson, who compared vaccine and mask mandates to practices in Nazi Germany. The Nazis dehumanized Jewish people before segregating them, he tweeted in January. Trump endorsed him a few weeks later on the 9th of February. The results of the upcoming GOP primaries in the months ahead will be very interesting. I'm Jeremy Beck for TNT Radio.
If you love them enough to listen to them practice the same song on tuba,
please be done.
Over and over and over and over and over, then surely you'll check NHTSA.gov/the right seat to make sure they're correctly buckled in the back seat.
Sounds good, honey.
Check today at NHTSA.gov/the right seat. Brought to you by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Ad Council.
Challenging the consensus and debunking the narrative. This is Viewpoint.
Solar power is supposed to help the environment. Modern economies require power 24/7, not just when the sun shines. And storing power is very expensive. Peak electricity demand in many nations with service-based economies occurs late in the day as the sun is setting. And cloud cover means we can never depend on solar power. Photovoltaic solar panel production is very resource intensive. Coal is the primary energy source used for photovoltaic panel production. And China, the world's biggest coal producer and consumer, produces 2/3 of the world's solar panels. While solar panels have a limited life of around 2 decades, some fail well before then. But nearly all solar panels currently go to landfill, as the cost of recycling is so high.
When you need to know what's going on around the world and at home, keep it on Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to TNT, Today's News Talk. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're cruising into the latter part of the second hour right now in this live broadcast, and very pleased to be joined by a wonderful guest, former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. Mr. Peter Ford is joining us on the line right now. And so Peter, let's get into one of your areas of expertise, which is diplomacy. Which is negotiations. Is it possible for Kiev to sue for peace at this point when all of this money is pouring in? Peter, Defense Secretary Ben Wallace says success is very possible. It's really difficult to say what their chances are, because the word coming out of Kiev, looking at Alexei Arestovich, one of Zelensky's high-profile advisors, says that it's probably impossible to reverse the situation on the front line. There's a lot of mixed messages going on here, Peter. What are the chances of any kind of a ceasefire anytime soon?
Fairly non-existent, Patrick. I'm sorry to say. I can't see much incentive on either side, the Russian or on the Ukrainian NATO side. Both think that they're capable of making more progress, and as long as that equation holds, then both sides will continue to fight. I don't think the Ukrainians are ready to cede territory, as they would inevitably have to do at the negotiating table. And I don't think Russia is ready to compromise on its own war aims. So also there's the fact that nobody's trying very hard to act as an intermediary to arbitrate. There are no big boys out there who could come in and mediate. The UN is not equipped for this role. Washington is a party to the fighting. Many people are calling for Washington to do more peacemaking, but to do that, they'd have to back off. They would have to stop pumping in billions more arms, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. So I would rate the chances of a negotiated settlement anytime in the next 6 months as between 0 and 1%.
Well, look, let's just look at this in realistic terms. This is still a low-cost exercise. Besides the cash and the weapons, it's still a low-cost exercise for NATO because they're not directly involved. But for Ukraine, for Kiev, this government that's in power right now, how long can they stay in power if they're continually sustaining losses, losing territory? There's got to be a morale issue. This could be ripe, Peter. Could it be ripe for a military coup? And then you could have an ouster. Zelensky goes to Poland, government in exile. You saw these sort of scenarios that were sort of designed with Libya, with Syria, where the West had that kind of exiled government. Those seats were warm. So there is there's pedigree to that type of situation. What do you think here? How long if Kiev keeps sustaining losses? How long can they keep their shape with the people, the military, and the government?
For a long time to come, I think I have to say reluctantly. In the early days of the conflict, in the first couple of weeks, that did look like a distinct possibility that Zelensky would be elbowed aside by more realistic politicians who would strike a deal with Russia. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. Now, there is this impression, it may be an illusion, it's hard to say, but there's this impression being cultivated that the Ukrainian armed forces are standing their ground, even pushing back the Russians in one or two places. As we keep being told by the Western media that Zelensky is wildly popular with his own people. There's no internal dissent, and there's little intelligence publicly available to suggest otherwise. So I wouldn't pin any hopes on some kind of coup to bring about a more realistic government in Kiev.
Yeah, well, that's that means that we could see, because my feeling on this, Peter, is that the longer this goes on, this status quo that we're looking at here, the longer this goes on, the less territory that Kiev is going to end up with by the time there's some negotiations. because then this becomes a kind of an ongoing security imperative for Russia, doesn't it? Because NATO is effectively at war with Russia on Ukrainian soil. So Russia can't stop at Kherson. They have to continue through Odessa, then to Moldova, to Transnistria, in order to secure. They can't have Odessa being a NATO arms port, basically. So, do you think that's a reasonable assessment? In other words, you could be looking at a smaller Ukraine in 8 months' time if the status quo continues?
No, it's sort of like Syria, where we see that outside invaders come in, the Israelis, the Turks, the Americans occupy some territory, and it's supposed to be provisional, and it goes on forever. The Israelis have actually purportedly annexed the Golan. The Turks have been several years now in northern Syria. The Americans, with their Kurdish mercenaries behind them, have been controlling for at least 5 years the northeast. And then look at Cyprus. No, these frozen conflicts are called frozen for a reason. And I think Ukraine is well on the way to becoming another frozen conflict.
Yeah, I think definitely the Syria comparison is pretty accurate. So we have some kind of proof, some precedent there that this is actually likely to happen here as well. Now, Macron is a potential. He was kind of making the move as a potential mediator. Obviously, France is a party to the conflict, like the UK and other NATO countries. But he made a statement that to me was quite incredible. They're warning Russia against, lording over Kiev when the war's finished. He said the war must finish first, and then Russia and Ukraine must sit down and negotiate. Am I wrong, Peter, or is that equation backwards as to what we would normally expect? Don't you negotiate first to end the war? They're saying that the war must end and then they negotiate. That seems to me like a recipe for, like you said, a frozen conflict.
Yeah, it's not entirely unrealistic to speak of a truce in situ. So the battle lines are drawn, and there's a pause in the fighting to permit a better atmosphere for negotiations to succeed. That is not a wildly unrealistic scenario, but there ain't going to be a truce. There's not going to be a pause. Neither side, I think, are yet ready for it. The Ukraine government are being buoyed up by all this Western support. They appear to be domestically secure, and they're not ready to absorb the pain. And it would be very painful to concede the loss of big swathes of territory.
And here's a potential. Is this a potential ray of light here? The United States midterm elections coming up in November. The first thing this is going to do, Peter, like the abortion issue right now at the Supreme Court, it's the public support has basically cratered. Or interest is cratered in terms of, the fickle U.S. Virtue signaling political mobs. They do shift from issue to issue, and the midterm elections in the U.S. is really from this point going to suck a lot of the media attention, and political capital is going to be sucked into that story in America. But if the Republicans take the House and Senate, there is this kind of still this Freedom Caucus in the Republican Party, Rand Paul and a handful of others, that could provide possibly some opposition to continuing this frozen conflict in Ukraine. Is that a potential game changer? I'm looking for possible rays of light here, to stop this impasse, Peter. Is that one of them?
from your tone, Patrick, I sense some desperation and clutching at
I'm sorry, I'm
straws.
stabbing in the dark here, Peter. But
yeah, it's true that on the Republican side there are one or two voices of sanity, like Rand Paul, and there are none on the Democrat side. But there's pretty much, isn't there, bipartisan support for foreign wars. And this is one of them. Not holding out any hopes there.
Yeah, I thought, the thing about...
And this is one of them. Not holding out any hopes there.
Yeah, I thought, the thing about this, Peter, is when this started, I thought the biggest war hawks were in Washington. And we've got Lindsey Graham, and a few other junkyard dogs in Washington that are basically off the leash on this. And, they want to take out Putin and the rest of it. But, I've never seen anything like what I see in Westminster. I didn't realize the fervor of the anti-Russian. It's almost... the animus is off the scale, Peter. Even from a neocon point of view, I couldn't even see the neocons that malicious or hating Russia on such a deep level. What do you think? Is this new? Is this old? Is this tapping an old vein, or what? Where did this come from?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. The ultimate British nightmare is captured in the phrase, they arrived with snow on their boots. The ultimate British nightmare is that we'll get invaded by Russians pitching up on the shores of Scotland with snow on their boots. And this goes back to the days of the Russian Revolution. We've been terrified of Russia ever since then. And geographically, they are a bit closer than they are to America. I think Americans perhaps tend to see the Russians in more rational geostrategic terms. But the British see them in more emotional terms. And then there are also the British domestic politics involved. That in the old days when we had a British Communist Party, then most of the British left was hostile to that, and therefore hostile to Moscow. I remember my own father, who was a trade unionist, a Labour supporter, hated Moscow. Partly because of the communist trade unionists who were rivals for power within the movement. So you got all these currents, and then you just have the sheer boneheadedness of people like Boris Johnson, and cynicism milking the Ukrainian crisis for temporary political advantage.
Yes, yeah. I hear ministers hearkening back to the Crimean War, saying, we're going to send in the Gurkhas and kick the Tsar up the backside, and literally saying things like this. And I wonder if they really know what they're saying, or if they're just trying to posture in public. I don't know. I think this is, the longer this goes on.
Yeah, we've never forgiven the Russians for shooting their monarchy. We're still a monarchy, remember?
Oh, yes.
We're reminded very much today as it happens, the Queen's speech in Parliament. And these things are important in emotional terms. For us, the Russians are the dark other against whom we pit ourselves and define ourselves.
That's an interesting. So you're going really deep there. That's an interesting thing to look at, the monarchy. We'll have to explore that a little bit further in another conversation. But I just wanted to, thank you very much, Peter Ford, for joining us this afternoon on TNT. I really appreciate your insights and your analysis on all the different aspects of this story.
You're welcome, Patrick. It's been a pleasure.
No, the pleasure is all ours, ladies and gentlemen. There he goes. That is former ambassador to Syria and Bahrain from Britain, Peter Ford. We're going to take a short break here at TNT, Today's News Talk, and we're going to pivot. We're going to pivot to U.S. politics and the world of Elon Musk in the third hour, and we'll speak to American political commentator Daniel Spalding on the other side. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We'll be right back.